Well, it's good to see so many of you turn out today. I hope you're all having a wonderful time. And I'd just like to introduce our three speakers today. We've got going from left to right, we've got Alastair Reynolds. He's a leading author in hard science fiction and space opera. Been nominated 3 times for the Arthur C Clarke Award for writing science fiction. He's known for his Revelations-based novels and has recently published a Doctor Who novel as well. And before becoming a full-time writer, he worked for the European Space Agency. Next to Alastair, we got Peter Ellis. Peter is an author with Elsewhere Press, which is a small independent publisher who specialises in speculative fiction. He's published, I think, is it 3 or 4 novels previously, and his first genre novel came out in ebook about 2 weeks ago. And finally, we have James Christie. James is the author of Dear Miss Landau, a book about his travels across America to meet the actress Juliet Landau from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I'm glad I'll be your chair for the afternoon. So, hopefully, without further ado, I'm going to let our speakers say a little bit about themselves.
Me? Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm Al. There's a very handy clock up on the wall there, so if I'm still talking at 2 o'clock, I think I've gone on too long. But I thought I'd just talk a little bit about how I got into science fiction. And it's kind of a shock to me that this year I will have been writing science fiction professionally for 25 years, which is absolutely shocking. And that's almost half my life. I'll be 50 next year, so I'm halfway through my life, and I've had 25 years of a science fiction career. But how I got into it, well, I think formative influences are quite important. And when I was a child, there were two television programs that I was really sort of attracted to quite strongly. And one of them was Star Trek, and the other one was The Virginian, which was a sort of a black and white Western series that used to run in the sort of 60s and early 70s. And sort of years later, I love science fiction. I still love Star Trek. I love space travel, but I also love horses and westerns and cowboy films. So go figure. I think the things we're exposed to when we're small do make quite a difference. Well, my sort of entry into reading science fiction, rather than watching it on television, came through Arthur C Clarke. And when I was about 8 years old, I started subscribing to a magazine, which wasn't a science fiction magazine, but it was a kind of boys' magazine full of sort of pictures of battleships and cutaway drawings of tanks and stuff like that. It was fantastic. But at the end of each issue, they would have a short story by Arthur C Clarke. And I didn't really know who Arthur C Clarke was at the time, but I found these short stories to be absolutely fantastic. And they were typically about people building space stations or colonizing the moon, and something would go wrong, and there'd be a bit of drama and a bit of a surprise in the story. And I really enjoyed them, and I sort of felt that this was something that I liked reading, and I wanted to read more of it. And I think the critical thing about Arthur C Clarke's writing that I responded to was that he tried to get the science right. He had a sort of scientific background. During the war, he'd worked on radar technology, so he knew sort of physics, he knew astronomy, and that was reflected in his stories. Now, had I read a completely different writer, that probably would have sent me on a completely different path. But for me, the type of science fiction that Clarke writes or wrote was very, very attractive to me as a reader, and it sort of made me want to write stuff like that. Well, I started writing, trying to write science fiction really from the point where I could write anything, and I wrote stories right through my early years. By the time I was a teenager, I was so serious about it that I wanted to. First of all, I wrote a novel when I was 16. I finished it when I was 16, and then I immediately started writing another novel. But I didn't really have any thoughts about publication. And it was only probably when I was around about 16 or 17 that I started actively thinking about how do you actually make a career as a writer? How do you actually get from, if you like, the kind of things we write at school as assignments to things that are actually published? And I discovered that there were such things as science fiction magazines. And I thought, this is amazing that these things are out there somewhere. I've never seen one. And it was almost impossible to get your hands on these things in sort of 1982 if you were living in South Wales before the internet, how would you get your hands on, say, Asimov's science fiction magazine if it wasn't in John Menzies or W.H. Smith's? You couldn't. But I knew that these things were out there, and I kept my eyes peeled, and I kept on writing science fiction stories with a view that one day I would try and break into publication. Round about the time I went to university to study space science, I finally found that there was a British magazine and that you could subscribe to it, and then you could also submit material to them. So I started bombarding them with really bad science fiction stories from about the age of 19 through my sort of early 20s. And although it seemed to take years and years and years, eventually they bought a story from me. And that magazine was Interzone, which is amazingly still going. I didn't destroy it. I didn't kill Interzone off with my first story. But they came back and they bought some more stories off me, and it was a fantastic thing. When I was, let's see, I would have been 1989 when I got my first check, so I would have been, how old am I? 23 years old. And you get a check, you know, and it's not, you don't have to spend it on your student accommodation or anything. You can actually spend it on beer or curry or more science fiction. So it was absolutely fantastic. And I you know, the idea that you could write this stuff and be paid for it was brilliant. Well, what I quickly discovered was, because I had this connection, I was studying space science, I got a degree in it, then I went on to do a PhD in Scotland in astronomy. That made me more interesting to magazine editors and publishers. Lots of people write science fiction, lots of people aspire to write science fiction, but to have science fiction stories written by someone with one foot in science immediately sets you aside from the other writers, at least in view of the editors, because they like the idea that you've got some sort of credibility to what you're writing. There's a sort of a bedrock of authenticity, which may be completely bogus. You know, I can write a science fiction story that's based on completely stupid, wrong science, but because they know that I have this background in space science, they think it must be authentic. So you know, it can be quite fraudulent at times, but I've traded on that over my entire career, and I still think that being a scientist, or having been a scientist, definitely opens doors for me as a writer, and I've benefited from it. Well, I went on to have a career for about 20 years in space science, and now I only write science fiction. That's what I do for a living. And so I'm in a position of, I'm a writer who used to be a scientist. And again, that makes me more interesting to people. You know, an example we had when I was working for the European Space Agency, we'd done some science, which we were very proud of. And we wanted to publish it in Nature because that was the most prestigious journal to get your results into. And they said, you know, they basically told us to sod off. They said the science wasn't sort of, you know, there's nothing wrong with the science. They said it's just not original enough to justify publication in Nature. So we published it in Astronomy and Astrophysics, and you know, which was sort of a step down. And you know, almost a week later, I get a letter from the editor of Nature saying, "Would you write a science fiction story for us?" So I think, you know, on one sort of level, you're sort of knocking on a door that they won't open, and then a week later, they say, come round the back, come into the secret club of Nature, you know. So that was all very sort of strange and interesting. And that sort of carried on ever since, that just being a science fiction writer with a foot in science has been really, really useful to me. Well, I talked about the type of science fiction that Arthur C Clarke wrote. I've just come up with a new word. He wrote what we generally call hard science fiction, hard SF, which is a horrible term, but we're stuck with it. No one can agree on a definition of hard SF, but it basically means science fiction where there's some attempt to keep the science grounded in what we know to be possible. So you wouldn't necessarily, you know, in a hard science fiction story, you wouldn't have wizards, you wouldn't have magic, and you might have, say, quantum teleportation or something like that, but it will be, there will be at least a nod to the possibility that it might be something that could happen in the future. And hard science fiction is very interesting. It's still a strong part of the science fiction genre, but it kind of brings I mean, I find it sort of liberating in many ways, but also constricting and constraining, and it's something I'm always sort of fighting against in my own writing, that you write stuff that you're trying to be accurate to say, I mean, I'll give you an example at the moment. I'm writing a story set in Jupiter, set in the clouds of Jupiter, in the atmosphere of Jupiter. Well, my sort of plot demands may force me to, I may force myself up against an aspect of the physics of the interior of Jupiter, which actually doesn't work very well for my story. And this is constantly annoying, you know, and it's like, why does Jupiter have to have a pressure of 10 bars at so many kilometers deep? Why can't it be 8 bars or something like that? And you're then in this sort of dilemma. Do you bend the story to fit the science and maybe make a less compelling story? Or do you quietly break the science, or at least bend the science? So, well, no one's going to notice. I'm just going to muck about with Jupiter a bit, but, you know, who cares? At least I'll have a good story. And I think if pushed to the wall, I think the story should always be dominant. You know, if you're breaking the narrative to keep the science correct, then you're not really doing fiction, and what you'll produce will be sort of artistically unsatisfying. Sometimes it's very hard to sort of tell when you should and shouldn't bend the rules of science. But generally speaking, I feel that fundamentally we are storytellers, and that's the important thing. It's to be telling stories. So yeah, I find hard science fiction utterly fascinating, but also very frustrating as well. And I kind of, you know, to some degree, I reject the label when it's applied to me, because it also brings a whole set of assumptions. If you're defined as a hard science fiction writer, then people get very cross when you put things in that aren't rigorously correct. And I said, well, you know, I never said I was a hard science fiction writer, but nonetheless, once that label is on you, it's very hard to sort of peel it off. But no, I continue to be interested in sort of the interface of science and fiction, and you know, I don't see any particular limitations to science fiction, and you know, at least the way I approach it, I feel that there's still a lot of mileage in it, and I'm still enjoying myself. So sort of 25 years in, I was talking to another writer. I said, I don't feel that I'm halfway through my career yet. Do you? And he said, no, I don't either. So hopefully we can keep doing this for a few more decades. So I've said my piece. 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Right, yeah, thanks very much, Al. And we're going to turn over now to Peter Ellis.
Well, hello. It's a great delight to be here. I feel a bit of an interloper because my books are only just coming out, my first fantasy series. So following Alastair, who's been one of my heroes for, I'm not quite sure it's 25 years, but certainly quite a few years. So I really feel very privileged to be sitting next to him. But I'm here partly on behalf of Elsewhen Press, who are a small publisher run by two fantastic people, Peter and Alison. And for the last few years, they've put together a list of about a dozen or so authors writing in the science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, whatever you want to call it, area. And over the years, they've put up to about 30 books now. And I say I'm very proud, wear their badge, to be one of their authors now. And my first two fantasy books are coming out this very moment, out in e-books and out in paperback in March. So if you want to find some science fiction and fantasy, go and look up Elsewhen Press on the internet and look at their list. It covers all different types of science fiction and fantasy, from the hard stuff to the more way-out fantasy. But talking about myself, which I suppose we're here to do, I can't remember when I actually started reading science fiction. It is I always have done. When I was a young kid, I used to go to the library once or twice a week and devour all the books in the children's section. When I was about 10 or 12, I read all the science fiction I could find in the library's children's section. They wouldn't let me go to the adult section. They wouldn't let me go to the foreign literature. So I devoured all the Jules Verne they had. But from there, I moved on to all the other science fiction writers. Alastair's mentioned Arthur C Clarke. He was one of my favorites, but of course the other greats of the 40s and 50s, Asimov, Heinlein. But I suppose the British writers, I always had one of my favorites, I suppose, Aldous, Blish, Brunner, Harry Harrison. I suppose for the first, well, until I was about 30, I suppose, science fiction formed the vast majority of what I read. But at the same time, I was dabbling in writing down my own ideas. I finished school, went to university, I studied chemical physics. And then, because I couldn't decide on what bits of chemistry and physics I liked most, I went into teaching and spent the next 35 years as a science teacher, largely chemistry, pursuing all the different bits of science which I loved. It's a great pleasure, actually, kind of seeing pupils' eyes light up as you kind of explode a bit of sodium in water or something like that. Lots of pleasure from teaching, but I never had the nerve to kind of follow my first love, which was actually to pursue the writing. So unlike Alastair, who took the step, I waited and waited and waited until I took early retirement from teaching, which was about 5 years ago now. But in the meantime, I got into writing textbooks. And actually, I think that's probably more lucrative than writing novels, because it certainly pays a little bit better, certainly in the early stages. You have to sell a bestsellers, I think, to make much money in writing the novels. But, so for a few years, I've been writing textbooks and educational material, but all the time wanting to get my ideas down on fiction, short stories, longer stories, finally the novels. The funny thing was that I turned away from writing science fiction, whereas for my first part of my life, I'd written science fiction stories, short ones. Latterly, I kind of got into other areas. Actually, I'm not sure I should be ashamed to admit this, but my first sale of a novel was for a book of erotica. But we'll pass that by. I then started writing a crime series. I'm still writing that, and published the first volume of crime novel. It's called Painted Ladies. It's by P.R. Ellis, not Peter R. It's about a transsexual detective. That's another side of my history. But then I got an idea for a book, which I suppose is fantasy, except it's not really. It's based on science. It's based on my love of history of science. And I suppose I got a bit frustrated a little bit the way science fiction has gone in the last 50 years. We seem to have got scared of new science, whereas back in Asimov's days and so on, leaping into hyperspace and so on, writers did a scribble of a pen. We seem a bit worried, as Alistair says, we're getting this science actually right now. I think we need to be as speculative as we like. So one of my ideas has always been that when a new theory comes along, or some scientist has produced a new theory which is adopted, it seems that everything changes. And my idea was, I don't think it's original, I'm not sure who would have had it first, but my idea was that perhaps the whole universe changes when someone has a new idea. And so perhaps before Copernicus and Galileo decided that the sun went round the earth, the earth went round the sun, perhaps before that, the earth actually was fixed and everything went around it. So that was the starting point or one of the starting points for my fantasy series. Perhaps there is a universe where everything we believed before Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and Lavoisier and all the other famous scientists, perhaps that actually happens. That's what that universe is based on. How my story actually began, I'm not sure how many of you consider yourself writers. If you write anything down, you're a writer. If you attend a writing group, I found that very useful to actually go along to a writing group once a week or once a month and share my ideas with other writers. One of the writing groups I went to used to set ourselves homework each month, write something on a particular theme. And a few years ago, we were doing something for Halloween. It just came into my head, this picture of druids processing around in circles around a circular altar. And that kind of idea stuck in my head. Again, not particularly original, but I also had a character, which I've been trying to find a story for. Given her the name, September Weeks. Silly name, September. But, she's a teenager, just approaching her 16th birthday. She's a bit of a loner, doesn't fit in. She's bullied, has problems. Teachers don't think she's very bright. But suddenly this adventure happens to her, which puts her in a position where she potentially has great powers, but she has to learn how to use it. And she's in a world, this universe, which is past scientific knowledge. She's in this strange world where she's given a very big task. The other theme in the story is good and evil. Now, I've always been told that I see the best in everybody. Well, I try to. It's a good idea when you're a teacher. And I always see that people are essentially good, and the evil is something which comes from outside. So that's another theme which runs through the series. The evil, the malevolence as I call it, is something that infects the universe, attacks the universe, and attacks the people in it. And the people, the good people, have to fight back. And the last theme in the series, an important one. I'm from Wales as well, like Alastair. We're born not far apart, actually. I was in Cardiff. I've always loved Welsh myth and legend and the stories of from the Mabinogion and so on. I like the Welsh language as well, Celtic language. So I've used that in the story, and the kind of there's a reason for it. You have to get to volume 3 before you find out what the reason is, and that's not going to be published yet. But there's a reason for why this strange other world actually has Welsh as its founder language, and the mythology is Welsh or Celtic. So that's my book. I think I've used up my 10 minutes. I've got the leaflets, which I shall hand out later. But thank you for listening. I hope I haven't said too much of self-promotion, but science fiction is fun. Let's enjoy it.
Yeah, you're very right, Peter. So thank you very much for that. Obviously, I think you're going to be staying around for some of the events. If anyone wants to find out more about Peter's books, as he says, he's got some leaflets available. And last but by no means least, I'm now going to turn you over into the capable hands of Mr. James Christie.
Oh, capable. That's good. Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Right, that's great. Those in the front, rattle your jewellery. Those in the back, clap your hands. John Lennon, 1965 or thereabouts. The thing about a writer as well is we've always got this overpowering urge to get lynched by whatever bunch of very nice middle-class people who are in the lecture hall talking to us. Now, I'm also an Asperger, and I think Mr. Reynolds, you said that you were inspired by Star Trek.
Yeah.
I stole the Enterprise. I got a vampire for a flatmate. I got into correspondence with a Hollywood star, and I crossed America on a Greyhound bus to meet my film star on a boulevard west of Sunset one Sunday morning in March. And all of that happened, and I did it, and it was the most bloody exciting thing you'll ever see or feel or hear in your lives. And I'm sitting here thinking how to explain it to you and try and tell you what it was like, and so, step 1 to get myself in trouble. Has anyone got much knowledge of what the pictures behind me are and what I'm talking about? Has anyone ever heard of the book Dear Miss Landau? Don't worry, raise your hand if you've got no idea what I'm talking about. Great. We're doing very well here. Right. Anyone ever heard of, Star Trek? Right, better. Right. Anyone ever heard of Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Right, okay, now I'm going to say something that's going to sound absolutely crazy, and then I'm going to explain it to you. You know Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Right, you remember Spike's crazy girlfriend, Drusilla? Okay, Anyone a Drusilla fan, by any chance? No, and that's the thing. Because Spike and Angel and Darla and the rest got a lot of the publicity. And at the same time, thousands of miles away from Hollywood and California, I'm being diagnosed with Asperger's at the age of 37. And after that, I had a very traumatic time at work. And to recover from the trauma, I'd always had this writing ability. I thought I would just, for a bit of fun, write a short story about this vampire in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, has anyone ever heard a legend, a story where a writer will get some incredible connection with a character? Okay? It's okay, speak up. I don't mind that, you can clap, you can jeer, you can throw eggs. Anyone ever heard of this story? Because I didn't know about it. Really, not really. A friend on Facebook once said to me that it's called a tulpa, where the actual character will take form and just grab onto you for dear life and basically order you to write their story. Okay, that's what happened. I was sitting on a train going into the West Highland Line 5 years ago, and I thought, well, I think I'll start writing this story. I'll call it Drusilla's Roses. And it is as if she grabbed onto me for dear life. And it was just, forget about the, literary elegy or anything airy-fairy. This was like a great big industrial strength engine getting going and in no mood to take prisoners. Imagine somebody on a flying a large plane having to sort of suddenly take the controls, keep her straight and level, and go flat out like a bat out of hell, and you've got a general idea of what actually happened. So when I say that I got a vampire flatmate, obviously Drusilla is fictional, she doesn't exist, I know this. But think about people with autism, we think in pictures, or at least some of us do. And so it's a bit like a hologram coming up. I thought about Drusilla, she seemed to be taking up residence about either here or there, I'm not quite sure. And I would think about her and she would appear. So, as a matter of fact, I have been thinking about her just now. So, see the table over there? She's there. Drusilla's here. Looking a bit shy, actually. Now, she doesn't speak to me. In the book, I mentioned that Leonard Nimoy always hears Spock's voice. She doesn't speak to me. But basically, for about 2 months, I had a vampire flatmate. Actually, it was 4 years. So I wrote the story, and I'm my old self again. I feel fine. Drusilla's sitting on the sofa sewing. All's well with the world. You can't go on like this. You can't go around telling people you've got a vampire flatmate. They're going to think you're absolutely, completely nuts. So I thought 2 things. I thought, right, try and get her out of my skull and send the story to the actress in Hollywood, whom I don't know. She's got a P.O. box number. And at the same time, I said to my employment consultant at the NAS in Scotland, hey, Jim, what if after 20 years of me doing nothing, I tried to travel again? I traveled across Australia for a year when I was in my 20s, but now I was in my 40s, basically like last shot Louis at the end of the line. What if I can get back like I was before? And he said, actually, he kind of looked at me for a bit, and then he said, you deranged maniac. Okay, we'll back you. Okay, right, we'll do it, yeah. Actually, it wasn't like that. You can read about what it was really like, and it was exciting. I even once said to him, right, okay, we've got to make plans now. Do I have a go or an abort? And it really was true. Did I try and do this or not? And we don't even know for sure. We think it might be the first time an Asperger's done and recorded this trip across the States, which I was planning. We're not sure, maybe. So, all right, I've sent the story off. I'm planning this trip across the States, and I'm spending the whole time saying, well, I'm doing this trip, publicize autism, and I will never know what happened to the story. And then, the actress who played Drusilla, daughter of Martin Landau, Space 1999, Edward, Martin Landau's daughter, Juliet Landau, Juliet Rose Landau, contacts me and says it's the best, well, I can read out what she said if anyone's interested. We'd like to? Okay, right. Great. 15th August 2009. Dear James, I just finished your story. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. You managed to catch Drusilla's voice and behavior so beautifully. The sad, lost, haunted feeling of Drew was there. I myself have just written a comic about Drew as part of season 6 of Angel. Please check it out if you'd like. You can probably imagine how I reacted to that. It was something along the lines of, I mean, if anyone says, they're sort of casual when they meet a star, it's absolute rubbish. I was on a complete adrenaline high for 6 months, So I've got Drusilla in the back of my head. I've got Juliet on my notebook. And if anyone buys my book, this is Juliet the Notebook, whom I took with me, right here, that's it. The one and only. And now I'm going across America to meet her. I mean, you couldn't make it up. I sum it up as Rain Man meets Notting Hill via 84 Charing Cross Road. Oh, and by the way, I'm also 6'4" and a natural blonde. Oh, and I can talk in public and all the rest of it. And how the heck anybody with Asperger's did this, I don't know. If there's anybody here who's a practicing psychologist or a journalist or knows a Hollywood producer, could they please come up to me afterwards? I'm not really joking. I don't know how the heck this happened. It happened. It's all true, every single word of it. Sorry, I'm going to have to go over there and do an adrenaline overload, I think. I mean, it was the most exciting thing you'll ever see in your life. And it was very, very serious, too. I'm probably over my 10 minutes now, aren't I? How am I doing?
Yeah, I think you just got a couple more.
Can I keep going?
Left.
Can I keep going?
Yeah, I say you got a couple more minutes left.
Okay, right. Okay. Sorry, motor mouth when I get going. And I'm saying it jokingly, but at the time, I'd been traumatized from work. I wasn't in good shape. I even went back to a boxing gym on the south side of Glasgow, the aptly named murder capital of Scotland, Govan Hill, lovely place. Lovely people, rarely actually, unless they're trying to murder you. And they're not. And I'll just throw in a plug for the Kelvin Amateur Boxing Club, Chaplin Books, and the NAS in Scotland, and particularly James Doherty. And anybody else who wants to bribe or blackmail me to mention their name. Right, so anyway, but it was serious. I honestly did not know, now that I knew I was an Asperger, could I do this again? It's the old problem of any middle-aged man, because Mr. Reynolds is pushing 50. I already am 50. And then again, I'm not. I'll explain that later, I've got the time. And there really was this question, would I still be okay? Could I do it? Could we reach her? Could all of this actually come together? And we really weren't playing games. If you think of it as an operational takeoff in World War II, that's close. You're going out, it's very exciting. It's like taking ship, if you like. And you don't know if it's going to work. You really don't. So, okay, the scene that was a great inspiration to me, like a lot of people make fun of geeks and nerds and whatever, like in The Big Bang Theory, and they wear Star Trek costumes, they beam down in red shirts, they get killed, This wasn't like that. I'm probably getting near the end of time, so I just want to leave you on one thought. Anyone know the scene in Star Trek 3 where Kirk stole the Enterprise? That's what it was like. It really was. That's how it felt. It was like I took that ship and I took it out and I knew I was, if not throwing away a career, I shouldn't have been doing it. I was 45, I was out of shape. I didn't know whether everything would work when I got to the other side. I didn't know if I'd reach her. But that was how it felt. And I don't know why no Hollywood producers ever twigged this incredible real-life Asperger's story, which I want to come out to publicize autism. I don't know why they haven't just jumped on it. Probably just making Transformers 5 or something. And I think we're getting to the other point, so I'll just throw in another quick plug. I also blog for the Huffington Post, and about 2 years later, I actually met William Shatner. Oh yeah, I was very lucky actually. I'd gone to the Philadelphia Comics Convention. So I'm very pleased to be at this autism convention. And there was clear air between myself and William Shatner. So to quote Kurt, I just ran like hell. And I just, in and out of the barrels. And I tried to explain to him that he'd stolen the Enterprise as an actor with a set and I'd done it via literary metaphor. And I don't think he had the slightest idea what I was talking about. But I got his signature. I've got my personal copy over there. I'll show it to you if you want. The other thing is, just quickly, an apology. I hope somebody's recording this. I'm always very, very careful about using a certain Miss Landau's image, and I had no idea that this behind me was going to be running today. So, Julia, if you're listening, don't be mad at me. I didn't know it was going to happen. I'll explain later. And for an Asperger who's not supposed to be good at, let's just say, correspondence, it's a very complicated situation. So, okay, I've scratched the surface. I'll be here all day. It's very important to mention that this is not just some attempt to blatantly plug myself or say how wonderful and marvelous and glorious and handsome and blonde I am. It's to publicize autism. Can I get a bit more time?
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop you there, James.
Okay, I can get more time. That's great, lovely, wonderful, yeah. I would make as much fuss as you can. They're trying to make a stage musical out of this book. I've got a quartet of Drusilla-based novellas I can't get published, which are ready and to the same standard. I need an agent, I need somebody who can put pressure on, and I'd like to finish a companion volume to this book. And I will go on trying to publicise autism, but I need your help. There we are. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I say thanks very much, James. It sounds like you had a fantastic journey. If anybody does want to catch him and find out what happened, then James has a stall just down here by the stage, and he's got a number of books for sale. So, I think the first question to the panel, and I will exercise my chairman's privilege here and say this is one of mine. It's been said that science fiction, and I think speculative fiction more broadly, is a very playful genre. It has a lot of versatility. It can borrow from other genres. It can borrow from other bits of popular culture. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, no worries. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I got dragged into this by a vampire, stole the Enterprise, crossed America for my Helen of Troy, and if I'd stopped to think about the literary metaphors, I'd probably have crashed the bus. Tell you what, let's see if I can put the brain to work. Just tell me the question again, please.
Well, science fiction, I think, is a very flexible sort of genre. I mean, if, for example, you look at the X-Files, conspiracy thriller, Firefly, West in Deep Space, Alien, Friday the 13th on a spaceship, you know, what are your feelings on that?
Yes, Star Trek. Making of Star Trek, Whitfield, forgotten the first name, 1972.
Stephen.
Possibly Stephen E. Whitfield, 1972. Yeah, I got one of the originals. Sorry, I'm going into autistic detail. Mm-hmm. When Gene Roddenberry first tried to get a TV series made, I think it was something called The Long Hunt of April Savage, you know, with cheerful episode titles like Happiness is an Open Grave and stuff like that. And he just couldn't get anything past the network executives. And now I think of it, he invented the idea of Star Trek, possibly partly based on Forbidden Planet 1956, to use analogy and metaphor. I think there was one episode, The Enterprise Incident, which was based on Vietnam. Something like, you know, they had a fiasco, and the Enterprise Incident, they rewrote it and they won. And there was another one, forget the title, Trapped on a Planet, and Kirk has to balance of power, stuff like that. The science fiction was used as analogy and metaphor to illustrate problems in the world today. So I think they're inextricably linked. It's also, for me, I have the quote in my book, Hotspur had the Hornblower and Kirk the Enterprise. Every generation should have its heroes, and we would then try to emulate them. And the weird thing, the serious point inside the joke, is that that's really what I was doing. Like a kid in the 18th century would have been saying, I'll go off in the Hotspur like Captain Hornblower. I was stealing the Enterprise like Kirk. Not for real, of course, but there you are again.
Say a few words to answer the question. Wonderful thing about science fiction is it can do anything. If you look at the whole range of science fiction authors, they cover every other genre within science fiction. So I think science fiction is one of the, probably the most broadest type of literature there is. But thinking of humour, one of the, of course, the best science fiction writers, Douglas Adams, written as humour, but the science fiction in it is brilliant. Another one, a person I love, is Stanislav Lem. Some of his writing is incredibly funny. Yeah, science fiction can do humour, and humour is an important part of science fiction.
Yes, I mean, it's the genre that encompasses all other genres as far as I'm concerned, and that's why it's very It's very difficult to get bored with it, either creatively or you know, if you're a consumer of science fiction, it sort of seems to be limitless in its possibilities. But if you're creating it, you know, I've never reached the point where I've been bored with science fiction. A few years ago, you always have to tell your editor which book you're going to do next. You know, they always want to know what's coming up next. And I said, well, I'm doing this trilogy at the moment. It's set in space. It's about colonizing other planets and so and so. And then I'm doing another book right now, which has got a space setting, the one about Jupiter. And I said, by the time I'm done with that, I absolutely, there's no way in hell I'm going to want to write another space novel. So forget it. You're not getting a space book out of me in 2015. So, of course, it's January 2015 now, and I'm thinking, actually, I quite fancy writing another space novel now. I'm going to do another one. So I sent a long email to my editor yesterday saying, you know that book I told you you were going to get? It's not going to happen now because I want to do another space book. And that's because the form is infinite. You know, even within a little subgenre, say space opera or story set in space, there's so many different modes you can employ. There's so many different tones. You can go from, you know, like the comic science fiction of Douglas Adams to the satire of Stanislav Lem. I mean, it's just infinite. And, you know, I never feel constrained by it. You can do a science fiction Cold War story like Balance of Power. You can do science fiction as an allegory of gender politics on Earth or race politics. It's just limitless. And, you know, I think it's such a wonderful form of writing that it's very hard to see how it can be exhausted.
Well, thanks very much. Now it's the point where you guys get to take part. We're going to open the floor, and we've got some roving mics on hand. So, questions, please. Can I just stress, guys, we've got to keep these short because we've only got about 15 minutes left. So,
my name is Aaron. I'm more of a, sci-fi-wise, I'm more movie-orientated than I'm author-orientated, but I'd like to get your opinion on this. Should we be excited or deeply afraid of the next 3 Star Wars sequels?
Well, I can think back to 1977, when I just started teaching, actually. And I went to see the first episode of Star Wars. Actually, the cinema was quite empty. I managed to get into a matinee. The school I taught had an extra day off for some reason. And I remember just coming out of that cinema afterwards, absolutely flabbergasted. I'd loved 2001, 9 years earlier, but Star Wars was just something again. And I don't suppose I've had quite the same feeling ever since. But fingers crossed, eh? Let's hope.
Deeply afraid. I might be wrong, because I am quite the fan of the Star Trek reboot from a quantum physics analogy, considering Everett's many worlds theorem with special reference to Schrödinger's cat. Believe it or not, I'm actually being serious. I was never that taken with Star Wars. Now I'm going to get lynched. Yeah, thinking it in many ways, the bastard son of Lawrence of Arabia, who, and to dip into being very serious again, I was told by the man who actually diagnosed me, he was a very experienced expert, there's no doubt in his mind, that T.E. Lawrence did have Asperger's syndrome. As I've mentioned today to a lady, I was into rare book cataloguing and he was into cartography. He would piss off his employers a lot. True. And then he would vanish off into the desert on a camel. I vanished off into the Mojave in a Greyhound bus. So they really are real analogies. And Star Wars was fun, but to me, Lawrence of Arabia was a really great grown-up film. And Star Trek, again, as I say, to me, it far more clearly goes back into, in my case, for example, the type of quarterdeck breed who wants to get back into the center seat, and I know how that feels, so I admit my personal bias. Star Wars was fun, but Star Trek talked, and it still talks, much more deeply to me. And it may just have been a single cultural moment which really worked in '77, and it'll be a good film, but maybe not a great one.
Well, the bar was set, wonderfully low by George Lucas with the prequels. So I think he did us all a great favour. I think by ensuring that the next three films can't possibly be as terrible, can they? And I love Star Wars, but just those films were so. Well, it was just the third one wasn't as terrible as the first two, but that's just like saying this type of pollution isn't quite as harmful as this other type of pollution. But no, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not. I saw the first of the reboot Star Treks. I saw it in like almost the perfect conditions. Only half an hour before, I'd actually seen the space shuttle Atlantis go up. Then I went to see Star Trek in the widescreen cinema at Kennedy Space Center. That's pretty awesome. And I was like, wow, space, wow, it's amazing. And that's an amazing film. Second time I saw it, I wasn't quite as blown away by it. And the Star Trek Into Darkness, I really, didn't like at all. But I think there's something about J.J. Abrams' style that I think will be a better fit to Star Wars. Because I think he's a very restless director. He wants to get loads of stuff in. And I think that probably will suit the Star Wars universe better. So, I'll go into it with an open mind and a glad heart and hope that it's good.
Yeah, I think honestly I very much agree with that. I saw the trailer, I liked it. And I also agree about where Lucas went with the last lot. I mean, I went to see Attack of the Clones in the cinema. That was a 2.5-hour action figure commercial. Anyway.
Can I just say, I enjoy science fiction films, and I think the way special effects have come on and made so much more possible. But I just don't think films can ever equal the images you get from reading a good book by a good author. They provide far more imagination, and the science is also better as well. So I prefer to read a good book than actually go and watch a film.
Here. Okay, next question, please.
I always say there's a part of my brain that written science fiction lights up that films don't activate. But on the other hand, there's another bit that films activate that written fiction doesn't. So they're sort of complementary, and I can really enjoy a good science fiction film.
Okay, so a quick statement and a question. Statement is deeply afraid given how J.J. Abrams destroyed Star Trek, thanks to Into Darkness. My question is based on writing now. Well, I've created a sci-fi series which I hope will rival Star Wars and Star Trek. What's the best way to attract an agent for? Because I'm sure any writer in here will know the curse of being a writer is to get published, you need an agent. To need an agent, you need to get published. It's catch-22. So how would you say the best way to attract an agent would be?
Well, you're really not going to like this very much, but what happened to me, and I actually haven't got an agent yet, let us please note, is I got born with the talent. I went through 25 years of hell. I was then traumatized, essentially the metaphorical equivalent of being clubbed over the head by a length of wood. And as I say, in that sort of recovery, that sort of got me to my peak after all this strain and everything. I then went to my absolute emotional, psychological, intellectual, you name it, limits. And then I got more lucky than I can possibly describe. Well, I'm going to describe it. Oh, am I taking too much time away from anyone else? I apologize for it. You're okay? Right. What happened was I wrote Dear Miss Landau without a publisher or an agent or the slightest sniff of one. The NAS had tried to get me, I'll just dump the minute right now, Jessica Kingsley, and they said, oh, no, we don't think that's quite right for us. And I felt like coming down to London and putting a 2x4 straight through their window. But I didn't, and no, you shouldn't either. So I wrote Dear Miss Landau just as a manuscript. And I mean, we're talking serious lack of hope here. I mean, really serious. And I finished it early in 2011. And I was then blogging on something called the Good Library blog, where I was basically taking the piss out of my former profession of librarianship. And I wrote one sentence, and the sentence was, anyone know a publisher? That was a Friday night. I spent a weekend of unutterable depression, not clinical, because I'm not bipolar. Anyone seen Bridget Jones's Diary, where she expects that she's going to die alone and be found 3 weeks later half eaten by Alsatians? That was me. Very, very much so. Not really joking either. That was that weekend, the long weekend. On the Monday morning, Chaplin Books, my publisher, Amanda Field, contacted me and expressed interest because she also was a blogger on the Good Library blog and had been listening to me saying that I thought senior library managers should be shot out of the shuttle bay doors of the USS Enterprise in their underpants, and that the then culture minister, Ed Vasey, was as fit for his job as Jabba the Hutt was to run the triathlon, and other not-so-nice stuff. And
Well,
that's
it sounds like that turned out all
that's how
right
I got
for you
discovered.
I say, it sounds like it turned out all right for you in the end, James.
What, sorry?
I say, it sounds like it turned out all right for you in the end.
Pretty much, maybe,
Yeah.
perhaps.
I mean, to anybody who does want to write out there, I think the best piece of advice that I know was given to me by Neil Gaiman. It's simply one word: write. And any other thoughts, gentlemen?
If you're a writer, just keep writing. You've got to be persistent, keep trying. Make sure it's as good as you can possibly make it. I can't say mine's perfect by any means, but when I say I was very lucky that Elsewhere picked up my novels. You just got to keep going, keep trying, and keep sending off the stuff to publishers, agents, magazines, you name it. So keep going. Good luck.
I mean, luck does play a factor, unfortunately, and it's not something that people want to hear, but there is an element of luck. Networking as well. I got a book deal without an agent through luck. That I'd already broken into publishing short fiction, but I was trying to sell a novel, and then it turned out that my neighbour was a published writer, so I ended up getting his editor to take a look at some sample chapters of my manuscript. The only reason that I ever found out that my neighbour was a writer was because we were both subscribing to the same magazine. And the editor said, hang on, your addresses are virtually the same. So, that's just sheer luck. But it wouldn't have happened unless I'd taken the initiative to subscribe to the magazine. I got an agent. As soon as I had an offer in place from a publisher, I then got in touch with an agent, which is not quite the way it's normally done. But there are no... Every story is unique. Every writer will have a slightly different story. The advice I always give is network. Go to conventions, go to fan meetings, that sort of thing, because all the editors and agents go to these things as well. And they're all very approachable. You just have to hang out with them and introduce yourself, get your face there, and eventually if you've got the right interesting stuff, they themselves will take an interest, because editors and publishers and agents are looking out for the new stuff. So it is, I think networking plays a huge part in it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say these days that there's quite a lot of people who self-publish. There's a lot of small presses who I think are interested in people who don't have agents, and there are also plenty of websites that list agencies, that kind of thing. So the information is out there, all right, gents?
Well, the information is out there. The place I went to was the Writers and Artists Yearbook, or the Artists and Writers Yearbook, which is, you can buy it in W.H. Smith. They do a different one each year, and it just contains all the addresses for agents and publishers. And each section will tell you the kind of thing they're looking for, the kind of thing they're not looking for. So you can phone them up and say, look, I've got this manuscript, it's about X, Y, Z. Is that the kind of thing you might want to take a look at? And generally, these people, they're generally receptive to new ideas. They are looking for stuff.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for two more very...
Send it to my editor. Well, I don't know about that. No, because I have enough time getting editors to read my stuff these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've got time for two more very quick questions.
My name's Ashley, and I'm 16, and I have a friend who's 17, and me and her are really into writing. I'm not so good, but I really enjoy it. And me and her have just started on a project, a shared writing project, where we take it in turns to write a chapter, and we're trying to get her friend to join us as well. So we've got 3 people, and the story is about a boy who his mother dies in a car crash, and he he has to go through brain surgery, and he gains the powers of the Flash from the DC universe. And I just wanted to know your opinions on the shared writing concept.
I'm doing a shared writing project right now. I'm writing. I mean, I'm working with another writer. We're writing a joint novel. We sat down over coffee in a hotel bar and said, right, you do that bit, I'll do this bit, you do that bit, and it's basically alternating chapters, and it's it's really interesting, and it's a really interesting way of working. So I would say if you're finding it enjoyable, carry on with it, because you'll learn a lot, and there's nothing to be there's no downsides to writing, and that's I've done a couple of collaborative things, and it's always different. You always learn something, and you always end up writing something that you wouldn't have produced otherwise. So I'd say go for it.
I've got no experience of collaborating on novels, but I think certainly having someone you can share ideas with and exchange bits of writing with is a great way forward. So whether you actually end up doing the whole novel together as a pair, that's great. Otherwise, just having the friend you're sharing ideas is a wonderful way forward as well. So good luck.
Right, very quick comment, James, then we'll move on to the last question, yeah?
Okay. Oh, sorry, did you?
Sorry, yeah, very, very quick comment if you're going to make one, and then we'll move on to our last question.
Oh, God, that's going to be difficult. Right. I'm got to be the bad cop in this one. I used to be part of an amateur film unit. We won, the McTaggart Prize in 1992 for Best Short Film, but the conflicts were enormous. I was thinking about it today because my ex-director has actually sent me a Facebook friend request. Do not ask me what I feel like doing with that Facebook friend request. It might work, I think, is my point of view, and it did once for this film called Ghost Dancer, where I had a very good friend, and I acted as the editor, and he was a writer, and we were on song. But a lot of the times it can go wrong. When I wrote Dear Miss Landau, it was essentially, sod everyone, I'm doing it my way.
Oh, okay, thanks very much. And I'm very sorry to everyone we don't have time to get to, but this is the last question, I'm afraid.
I was wondering, in terms of sci-fi books that were written a long time ago, a lot of them are becoming frighteningly prophetic. We've all heard how often 1984 has been mentioned in the news recently. I was just wondering, what are your opinions on how prophetic some sci-fi stories have become?
Sorry, I missed that question.
Right. Sorry, could you just repeat that? We didn't hear it very well up here.
I don't think
I was saying a lot of sci-fi stories have been very prophetic recently. We've all seen how often 1984 has been mentioned in the news. I was just wondering, what are your opinions on how prophetic some sci-fi stories have become?
We were speaking about this just now, about before we came on stage, about the sort of the science fiction as a prophetic medium, and it's something that comes up a lot. And I think science fiction writers and readers are we're sort of divided in a way, because you look at some science fiction functions as a warning, and you don't want it to become true. And we're really happy that 1984 didn't become true. So in that sense, George Orwell failed because 1984 didn't happen. But in a sense, it was genius because he gave us this narrative, these ideas, this discourse, terms like Big Brother, and a way of thinking about surveillance. So he actually triumphed by not predicting the future. That tradition within science fiction is still very strong. Of course, we don't know which books or works of now will be regarded as prophetic in 50 years' time, but certainly there will be some, and I think it's a very strong part of, it's a strong responsibility of science fiction to function as the awful warning, to give us a hint that we might be going in the wrong direction on different things, whether it's surveillance or genetic engineering or the war on terror, whatever it is. So yeah, very, very, very dominant strand of science fiction.
I think some organisations, probably Apple and so on, have teams of people trying to guess the future. I don't think it ever works out. The future is always different. Who would have known in the 1950s that the Apollo moon landings would be televised? Who would guess now that we'd have free almost free video phoning compared to how it was shown back in 2001, all that. Nothing ever turns out quite as it's written, but it's interesting to actually look back to see what hints there are in science fiction writing. I remember being very annoyed back in the 70s when I used to read a lot of H.G. Wells back then, and his predictions were pretty lousy, really, particularly because I was into chemistry. Nobody ever seemed to forecast plastics. So I think prediction is probably a game not to get into.
There's a fantastic story by Ed McBain, who was a crime writer, and he never wrote any science fiction apart from one little vignette, a tiny story, which was written in the 50s. And someone dug it up recently, and there's a bit in it where he makes a kind of disintegrate array. And the other character says, how did you figure out how to make the disintegrate array? And he says, I Googled it. And it's like, where the hell did that come from? It's amazing. It's just a lucky chance. He just used a word that made perfect sense.
It's not where Google got the name from.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
The only thing I think of actually being strictly straightforward about in the 1970s, BBC presenter James Burke was, I think, asked or postulated what things would be like in 40 years' time, and he's just done another one. It's on the BBC website. I think he did it last year. So you can see how it worked out for him and how his 1973 odd predictions worked out at the time.
Well, thank you very much, gents. So I'd like to say thank you to James, Peter and Alastair for being our panel today. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and for paying attention for the hour and for obviously asking for great questions. And I'll leave you with these words. There are worlds out there where the sky is burning, where the seas are asleep and the rivers dream. People made of smoke and cities made of song. Somewhere there's danger, somewhere there's injustice, and somewhere else the tea's getting cold. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Cheers. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you very much.